Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing legacies recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach you. The year was 1884, a grim epoch when the wild, untamed forests of the Missouri Ozarks stretched like a shadowed tapestry across the land. Dense, fog-shrouded woods met isolated frontier life on the edge of superstition and wilderness, creating a realm of perpetual twilight under ancient oaks, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural frayed like worn cloth. This was a land where every rustle could herald a predator or phantom, and the chilling winds carried whispers of dark folklore passed down through generations of settlers who understood that some secrets were meant to remain buried. In the heart of this forbidding landscape stood the Howler family farm, a reclusive homestead carved from rocky hills by sheer determination and backbreaking labor. The isolated cluster of log cabins and weathered barns seemed to huddle against the encroaching wilderness, as if aware of the malevolent forces that dwelt in the deep places of the forest. At the center of this domain ruled Elias Howler, a stern patriarch whose face bore the harsh lines of hardship and whose storm-gray eyes held depths that spoke of Irish immigrant blood laced with pagan echoes from an abandoned homeland. Elias was a man forged by adversity, his character shaped by the trials of frontier existence and the shadowy ancestral tales that had crossed the Atlantic in the minds of his forebears. His voice carried the gravelly authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience, and his weathered hands bore the calluses of endless toil. Yet beneath his practical exterior lurked a superstitious nature drawn from the old ways, the forgotten rites and warnings that his ancestors had whispered by dying fires in the hills of Ireland. These were tales of horned guardians and binding runes, of entities that protected forbidden knowledge buried deep in the earth, and of curses that could devour entire bloodlines if awakened by the unworthy or unwary. The Howler family comprised 6 children, each bearing the mark of their father's harsh rule and their mother's early death from fever. Jeremiah, the eldest at 14, possessed broad shoulders that spoke of premature responsibility, yet his gaze flickered with uncertainty like a candle in an unsteady breeze. The twins, Abigail and Thomas, both 12 years of age, were inseparable in their mischief and shared dreams, their bond strengthened by the isolation that surrounded their daily existence. 9-year-old Eliza moved through the world with eyes wide as moonlit pools, her young mind constantly absorbing and interpreting the strange sights and sounds of their remote homestead. Samuel, 7 years old, possessed the quick reflexes of a fox, but was haunted by night fears that seemed to grow stronger with each passing season. Little Mary, the youngest at 5, served as the fragile light of the family, her rare laughter a precious melody that pierced the gloom of their harsh existence. The dynamics within the Howler household simmered with underlying tensions born of loss, isolation, and the weight of survival in an unforgiving landscape. Elias had been forced to raise his children alone after his wife succumbed to fever years earlier, leaving him to instill lessons of survival that were heavily laced with the superstitions drawn from his pagan roots. During long winter evenings, when the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls and shadows danced in the firelight, he would speak of the old ways in hushed, reverent tones. These were warnings disguised as bedtime stories, tales of spirits that devoured the unwary and entities born from the collision of immigrant lore with the ancient whispers embedded in the very soil of the Ozarks. The children learned to fear not only the practical dangers of their wilderness existence, but also the supernatural threats that their father insisted lurked just beyond the edge of perception. He spoke of creatures like the horned howler, beings from local folklore that were said to stalk the mists with cries that blended the savage roar of wolves with the anguished wails of tortured souls. These guardians of forbidden secrets, according to Elias, would exact terrible vengeance upon those foolish enough to disturb the ancient places where power lay dormant, waiting for an unwary hand to break the seals that held darkness at bay. But fate, that most cruel and unpredictable weaver of destinies, had already begun spinning the threads that would lead the Howler family toward their doom. The catalyst came on an autumn evening, heavy with the promise of storm clouds that rolled in from the western horizon like harbingers of catastrophe. Thunder rumbled across the hills with a sound that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth, as if the mountains themselves were groaning in anticipation of what was to come. The air grew thick with moisture and menace, and even the wildlife seemed to retreat deeper into the forest, sensing that something momentous and terrible was about to unfold. Elias had been driven to his fateful exploration by whispers that had reached his ears in town, fragments of conversation overheard in the general store and at the mill where local farmers brought their grain. These were tales drawn from local archives and faded survivor journals that hinted at buried relics of power hidden throughout the Ozark hills. Some spoke of Native American artifacts left behind by tribes that had vanished into legend, while others whispered of treasures hidden by early settlers who had fled some unnamed catastrophe. The stories were vague and contradictory, but they all agreed on one essential point. There were things of value hidden in the deep places of the earth, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The hidden cave that Elias chose to investigate had long been the subject of conspiratorial whispers among the scattered inhabitants of the region. It was a forbidden place, shunned by neighbors who spoke of it only in hushed tones and always with the warning that some thresholds were never meant to be crossed. The cave's entrance was choked with thick vines and shadowed by ancient oaks that seemed to lean inward like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches creating a natural barrier that discouraged casual exploration. Local folklore insisted that this was a place where pagan ancestors might have sealed away malevolent forces, binding them with rites and symbols drawn from traditions older than recorded history. As the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy, with the promise of deluge, Elias approached the cave with his digging tools and a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The descent into the earth felt like a violation of some fundamental boundary, each step taking him deeper into a realm where the normal rules of existence no longer applied. The walls of the cave were damp with seepage, and strange formations of mineral deposits created shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if the very stone had been carved by intelligence rather than random geological processes. Hours passed as Elias dug with increasing fervor, his spade biting into earth that grew stranger with each layer he removed. The soil itself seemed to resist his efforts, clinging to his tools with unnatural tenacity, and more than once he paused to wipe away sweat that felt oddly cold despite his exertions. Lightning flashed outside the cave entrance, illuminating the depths with stark, momentary brightness that revealed glimpses of something that should not have been there. And there, buried in the deepest layer of mud and ancient sediment, his searching hands finally found their prize. An animal's skull, unlike any that should have existed in the natural world. The artifact was massive, larger than the skull of any wolf or bear known to inhabit the Ozark wilderness, and its surface was etched with mysterious runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern light. The horns that crowned the skull were curved like scythes, their points sharp enough to draw blood, and the entire structure pulsed with an unnatural warmth that seemed to flow from some internal source of power. As Elias lifted the skull from its earthen prison, the runes began to glow with a faint, sickly light that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The air around the artifact shimmered with heat distortion, and a low humming sound filled the cave, as if the very walls were resonating with some alien frequency. He knew, with the certainty that comes from generations of inherited wisdom, that he held something that had been deliberately buried, bound with symbols meant to contain forces that mortal minds could not comprehend. The storm had reached its full fury by the time Elias emerged from the cave, his prize wrapped carefully in sacking to hide its unholy glow. Rain lashed the landscape with supernatural intensity, and the wind carried sounds that seemed almost like voices, whispers of warning or perhaps promises of doom. The journey back to the farmhouse felt longer than it should have, as if distance itself had been twisted by the presence of the artifact he carried. That evening, as the family gathered around their rough-hewn table for their meager supper of cornbread and thin stew, the initial omens began to manifest. The skull, hidden away in the barn among the hay and farming tools, seemed to pulse with malevolent life, its presence affecting the very atmosphere of the homestead. Strange howls rose from the surrounding forests, sounds that cut through the storm's roar with unnatural clarity. These were not the familiar calls of wolves or coyotes, but something far more disturbing. A haunting fusion of bestial snarls and human screams that spoke of intelligence and malice in equal measure. The children paused in their eating, their wooden spoons hovering halfway to their mouths as the eerie cries echoed through the night. Fear flickered across their young faces like candlelight, and they looked to their father for reassurance that he could not provide. Elias attempted to dismiss the sounds as tricks of the wind, his voice rough with uncertainty, but his superstitious heart was already stirring with dread. He had smuggled the skull into the barn without his family's knowledge, drawn to its power yet increasingly aware that he might have unleashed forces beyond his ability to control. Family whispers filled the cabin as the howls continued, each voice adding to a chorus of growing unease. Jeremiah questioned the nature of the sounds, his 14-year-old mind struggling to reconcile what he heard with his understanding of the natural world. Abigail clutched Thomas's hand beneath the table, their twin bond providing comfort in the face of the unknown. Eliza, always observant, began sketching symbols in the spilled flour on the table, unconsciously mimicking patterns that seemed to echo the runes etched into the hidden skull. Samuel whimpered softly, his child's instincts warning him of danger that his young mind could not articulate. Little Mary buried her face against her older sister's shoulder, her small frame trembling with each fresh howl that pierced the night. Elias, his weathered features thrown into sharp relief by the flickering firelight, found himself compelled to speak of his heritage, to share fragments of the pagan lore that his ancestors had carried across the ocean like seeds of ancient wisdom. He told his children of runes that could bind demons, of symbols that served as barriers against forces that existed beyond the veil of normal perception. But even as he spoke, his words faltered and died as the howls drew closer, blending with the wind that moaned through the trees surrounding their isolated homestead. The turning point came in the deepest hours of the night, when the storm had reached its peak intensity, and the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed thinnest. In the barn, the skull's runes erupted with spectral fire, their glow penetrating the wooden walls like searchlights piercing fog. The entity bound within the artifact stirred to full wakefulness, sending out the first tendrils of its malevolent influence like a plague searching for susceptible hosts. Jeremiah, the eldest and perhaps most sensitive to the supernatural currents that now flowed through the farm, twisted in his sleep as visions invaded his dreams. He saw the horned beast in all its terrible glory, a massive form covered in coarse black fur, with eyes that burned like coals and a maw filled with teeth designed for rending both flesh and soul. The creature whispered to him in voices that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, promising consumption and offering the sweet release of madness to those who would surrender their sanity willingly. The boy's screams shattered the night's silence, bringing his family rushing to his bedside as he thrashed against invisible bonds. His eyes rolled back to show only white, and his voice, when he could speak at all, described horrors that no child should ever have to witness. The beast, he gasped, was coming for them all, drawn by the scent of their blood and the ancient obligations that tied their lineage to powers that demanded payment in suffering and souls. As this first chapter of horror drew to its close, the foundation had been laid for the terrible events that would follow. The Skull's awakening had begun a chain reaction that would ultimately consume every member of the Howler bloodline, spreading like a plague through family connections that stretched across the Missouri Ozarks and beyond. The curse that Elias had unknowingly unleashed would prove to be far more than a simple haunting. It was a deliberate trap, carefully constructed by ancestors who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to leave unguarded, and that the price of curiosity could be measured in generations of suffering. Subscribe to uncover America's darkest family curses. Your support reveals the howls that devour souls. The awakening of the horned beast marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would consume the Howler family from within. As the nightly howls grew louder with each passing moon, evolving from distant whispers into a terrifying symphony that blended the savage roar of wolves with the anguished screams of tormented souls. These cries were no mere sounds carried on the wind. They were the manifestation of a malevolent entity rooted in the deep folklore of the Missouri Ozarks, akin to the legendary creatures brought by Scots-Irish settlers in the early 1800s. Beings like the death hounds that prowled sacred woods as harbingers of doom. The beast's influence seeped into the very foundation of the isolated homestead, turning the once peaceful farm into a nexus of supernatural activity where reality itself seemed to bend and twist under the weight of ancient malice. Elias Howler's 6 children became the first victims of this predatory force, their young minds and bodies assaulted by visions of the horned beast and unexplained wounds that appeared without visible cause. Jeremiah, the eldest at 14, bore the brunt of the initial assault. He would wake in the dead of night, his body convulsing as spectral claws raked across his chest and arms, leaving gashes that wept blood but healed with unnatural speed. The boy spoke of seeing a massive creature in his dreams, covered in coarse black fur, with eyes that burned like coals and horns that twisted like the devil's crown. It whispered to him in voices that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, promising that his screams would feed its eternal hunger, and that his soul would be devoured piece by piece until nothing remained but an empty shell. The twins, Abigail and Thomas, both 12 years old, suffered together in their shared torment, their psychic bond making them doubly vulnerable to the beast's influence. They thrashed in their bed, crying out as invisible wounds bloomed across their skin, describing how the creature's cries invaded their minds like parasites, eating away at their sanity with each passing night. 9-year-old Eliza, once so full of innocent wonder, now huddled in corners, her small hands pressed against wounds that appeared on her back and shoulders, whispering that the beast was consuming her thoughts and replacing them with its own dark hunger. Young Samuel, 7 years old, lost his mischievous spirit entirely, hiding beneath blankets as gashes opened on his legs and arms, muttering that the horned beast was eating his courage and leaving him hollow inside. Little Mary, the youngest at 5, endured perhaps the worst suffering of all. She would wake with tiny claw marks on her face and neck, her cries merging with the external howls as she described how the beast fed on her light, devouring the joy from her soul, bit by bit. The madness onset was swift and merciless, manifesting not only in the physical wounds that marked each child, but in the psychological trauma that shattered their young minds. They spoke of shared visions, where the beast would appear in the family graveyard, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlight as it called to them with voices that promised sweet release from their suffering. The creature seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting them during their most vulnerable moments, appearing in dreams just as they were about to find peace in sleep, or manifesting as shadows that danced at the edges of their vision during the daylight hours when they thought themselves safe. Elias, witnessing his children's agony and driven to desperation by his own guilt, attempted to combat the supernatural force using failed protections drawn from his Irish pagan roots. He carved protective symbols into the doorposts and window frames, ancient runes that his ancestors had used to ward off malevolent spirits in the old country. He burned herbs gathered from the forest, sage and rowan, mugwort and vervain, filling the cabin with smoke that was meant to cleanse the air of evil influences. Salt circles were drawn around each bed, and iron nails were driven into the walls in patterns that echoed the binding symbols etched into the cursed skull. But each ritual seemed to have the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than containing the beast, these attempts at protection only amplified its power, causing the howls to grow louder and more frequent until they became a constant torment that never ceased. Community whispers began to spread like wildfire among the scattered neighbors who inhabited the isolated hollows and ridges of the Missouri Ozarks. Word of the eerie sounds emanating from the Howler farm reached the ears of farmers and trappers who lived miles away, starting local folklore that would echo through generations. Old-timers spoke of similar legends from their own childhoods, tales of creatures like the Ozark Howler that were said to guard ancient secrets buried in the deep places of the earth. These stories, passed down through oral tradition from the earliest Scots-Irish settlers, describe beings with glowing eyes and twisted horns, whose cries could drive men mad and whose very presence was an omen of death and disaster. The supernatural plague that had infected the Howler bloodline began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways as the weeks passed. The children's wounds grew deeper and more frequent, appearing not only during sleep, but throughout the day, as if invisible claws were constantly raking across their flesh. Their behavior became erratic and unpredictable. They would speak to empty air as if carrying on conversations with unseen entities, or suddenly break into screaming fits that lasted for hours without apparent cause. Mealtimes became exercises in terror as the howls would crescendo just as the family gathered around their table, the sound seeming to emanate from the very walls of the cabin. Elias found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the world, as the practical reality of frontier life gave way to a nightmare landscape where the supernatural held dominion. His faith in the protective power of the old ways was shattered with each failed ritual, each ineffective ward that only seemed to invite greater torment. He began to suspect that the skull he had unearthed was not merely a cursed artifact, but a deliberate trap, carefully constructed by ancestors who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to leave unguarded. The turning point came on a night when the moon hung full and blood-red in the sky, casting an eerie crimson glow over the fog-shrouded landscape. The howls reached a fever pitch that night, building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Little Mary, the youngest and most fragile of the children, began convulsing in her bed as the cries overwhelmed her small frame, her tiny body arching in agony as invisible wounds tore open across her chest and throat. Her screams merged with the external howls, creating a harmony of horror that seemed to feed back upon itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. Elias and the surviving children gathered around Mary's bed in helpless terror, watching as the life drained from her small form. Her eyes rolled back to show only white, and her voice, when she could speak at all, described the beast devouring her soul, consuming the very essence of who she was, until nothing remained but an empty shell. The first child had fallen her death, amplifying the chorus of cries that echoed through the night. And as her body went still with terror frozen on her young face, the family understood that this was only the beginning of their ordeal. The curse had established its hold on the Howler bloodline, and the beast's hunger was far from satisfied. As the chapter drew to its close, distant relatives began reporting similar symptoms in their own households, confirming that the supernatural plague was spreading beyond the boundaries of the farm, to claim every member of the extended family who shared the tainted blood that flowed through their veins. Comment your thoughts on ancestral curses. Like and subscribe for more bloodline horrors. The spreading plague of the Howler curse showed no mercy as it extended its malevolent reach beyond the isolated farm, seeking out every member of the extended family who shared the tainted bloodline that had awakened the horned beast's eternal hunger. Like ripples in a dark pond, the supernatural force followed bloodline connections across the Missouri Ozarks, manifesting in distant hollows and remote homesteads where Howler relatives lived their quiet frontier lives, unaware that their very existence had been marked for consumption by an entity that fed on terror and souls. By the winter of 1885, reports began filtering in from across 3 counties of similar afflictions, striking members of the extended family. The haunting blend of wolf howls and human screams that pierced the night air, the visions of a horned beast with glowing red eyes, and the invisible wounds that appeared without warning on the bodies of those who bore Howler blood. 23 relatives would ultimately fall victim to the curse before its appetite was temporarily sated, each death following the same terrifying pattern that had claimed little Mary and would soon claim the remaining children on the original farm. Cousins in Stone County reported waking to find their children covered in unexplained claw marks, babbling about a shaggy black creature that whispered promises of devouring their souls. An uncle living near the Arkansas border wrote frantic letters describing how his entire household had been plagued by nocturnal visitations, with family members found dead in their beds, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror and their bodies bearing wounds that seemed to have been inflicted from within. The victims were discovered in various states of horror, their features locked in the rictus of final agony as they had witnessed the approach of something too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. Some were found clutching religious symbols or protective charms, their desperate attempts at salvation scattered around them like fallen leaves, while others had scratched frantic warnings into the walls of their cabins. Messages that spoke of devouring cries and souls being consumed by an entity that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. Local physicians, called to examine the growing number of inexplicable deaths, could find no conventional cause for the fatalities, only the peculiar wounds that seemed to have originated from some internal source, as if the victims had been torn apart by forces that operated on both physical and spiritual levels simultaneously. As the body count mounted throughout 1885 and into 1886, whispers began to circulate about the true nature of the curse, carrying with them a disturbing revelation that would reshape the understanding of what Elias had unleashed when he disturbed the ancient skull. Hidden journals recovered from the belongings of the deceased hinted at a pagan conspiracy that stretched back through generations to a time when the first Irish immigrants had settled in the Ozarks and encountered forces that predated human civilization in the New World. These documents spoke of shadowy figures from the old country, practitioners of forgotten arts who had fled religious persecution in Europe only to find themselves confronted by indigenous spirits that demanded appeasement in blood and suffering. The conspiracy revealed itself through fragments of family history that had been carefully concealed for decades, stories of ancestors who had trafficked with entities that promised protection in exchange for future payment. The skull that Elias had unearthed was no random artifact, but a deliberate trap, carefully constructed and hidden by pagan forebears who understood that certain knowledge was too dangerous to leave unguarded. These ancestral figures had made bargains with forces beyond human comprehension, agreeing that their bloodline would serve as guardians and eventually as sacrifices to keep ancient secrets buried in the deep places of the Ozark hills. Elias Howler himself had begun to unravel under the weight of his guilt and the supernatural forces that surrounded him, his descent into madness marked by increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed what few neighbors still dared to approach the cursed farm. He spoke constantly of the old country and the sins of his fathers, blaming his immigrant heritage for the nightmare he had brought upon his family. His conversations became fragmented and incoherent, mixing English with fragments of Irish that he claimed were the voices of his ancestors speaking through him, warning of prices that must be paid and debts that could never be fully settled. He would spend hours carving symbols into every available surface of the farm buildings, frantic attempts to create barriers against the supernatural forces that had made his homestead their base of operations. The patriarch's rituals became more elaborate and desperate as the curse tightened its grip on his remaining children. He constructed elaborate circles of stones in the forest clearings, burning offerings of livestock and precious belongings in attempts to appease the horned beast or bargain for the lives of his offspring. But each ceremony seemed to backfire spectacularly, drawing not salvation, but greater attention from the malevolent entity that fed on his desperation. The howls that had once been confined to nighttime hours began echoing throughout the day, and nocturnal creatures started gathering at the edges of the farm. Wolves with eyes that glowed like coals, shadow forms that moved between the trees without making sound, and other beasts that defied classification but clearly answered to the call of the horned beast. Local authorities could no longer ignore the mounting evidence of supernatural activity in their jurisdiction, and a formal investigation was launched under the leadership of Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a practical man who had little patience for superstitious nonsense, but could not deny the testimony of his own senses. The investigation team included County Physician Dr. Samuel Morton, a representative from the state government named Harrison Webb, and several local men of good standing who had volunteered to help uncover the truth behind the mysterious plague of deaths. What they discovered on the Howler property defied rational explanation and challenged their fundamental understanding of the world they thought they knew. The official report, preserved in county archives and discovered during a courthouse renovation in the 1920s, documented the discovery of multiple ritual sites scattered throughout the farm property. Iron nails had been driven into the ground in specific geometric patterns that seemed to echo the runes carved into the cursed skull. Herbs had been burned in clay vessels, according to rites that drew from both Christian and pagan traditions, and animal blood had been spilled in quantities that suggested regular sacrificial ceremonies. The investigators found evidence of increasingly desperate attempts by Elias to bind or banish the supernatural forces that had taken residence on his land, but rather than containing the curse, these rituals appeared to have amplified its power and drawn additional entities to the area. The turning point in the investigation came when the team discovered a hidden cache of documents that had been sealed in a metal box and buried beneath the family graveyard. These papers, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be archaic Irish, told the true story of the Howler family's connection to the supernatural forces that plagued them. The documents revealed that the original Irish immigrants who had founded the Bloodline had been practitioners of ancient pagan rites, keepers of knowledge that had been banned by both church and crown in their homeland. They had brought their secrets to the New World, not as refugees, but as guardians tasked with ensuring that certain entities remained bound and certain knowledge stayed buried. The conspiracy deepened as the investigators realized that the skull Elias had unearthed was not an isolated artifact, but part of a larger network of binding sites scattered throughout the Ozark region. Each site was designed to contain a fragment of an ancient entity, with the various pieces held separate to prevent the reassembly of something too powerful for human control. The awakening of one fragment had apparently weakened the bindings on the others, setting in motion a chain reaction that threatened to release forces that had been safely contained for generations. As Sheriff Brennan and his team delved deeper into the mystery, they began to experience their own encounters with the supernatural. Team members reported hearing the characteristic howls even during daylight hours, and several investigators found unexplained scratches on their skin after spending time on the farm property. Dr. Morton documented strange phenomena in his medical journal, describing how the very air around the Howler homestead seemed to thicken and press against them with malevolent intent, making breathing difficult and causing disorientation that lasted for hours after leaving the site. The investigation reached its climax when Elias Howler himself was found dead in the family graveyard, his body positioned in the center of one of his ritual circles with the cursed skull clutched against his chest. His face bore the same expression of terror that had marked all the other victims, but his death seemed to have triggered something even more catastrophic. The remaining Howler children, Jeremiah, the twins Abigail and Thomas, Eliza and Samuel, all perished within hours of their father's death, their bodies discovered in their beds with wounds that suggested they had been literally torn apart by invisible claws. The last survivor of the immediate family was Elias's cousin, Amelia Howler Morgan, a woman who had married outside the bloodline but maintained correspondence with the cursed branch of the family tree. She arrived at the farm 3 days after the final deaths, drawn by a premonition that something terrible had occurred, and found herself alone among the carnage. Rather than fleeing in terror, Amelia displayed remarkable courage by documenting everything she witnessed in a detailed journal that would later become the primary source of information about the curse's final manifestation on the original farm. Amelia's journal, hidden in the cabin's foundation and discovered years later, described how the supernatural forces seemed to coalesce around the farm after the last of the direct bloodline had been consumed. She wrote of seeing the horned beast itself, no longer confined to dreams and visions, but manifesting physically in the material world as a creature of shadow and flame, whose very presence warped reality around it. The entity appeared to feed on the terror and suffering that saturated the property, growing stronger and more substantial with each passing hour until it achieved a form that could interact directly with the physical world. But even as the immediate family was consumed, the curse continued to spread through the extended bloodline, claiming relatives who lived hundreds of miles away and had never set foot on the original farm. Letters arrived from distant cousins describing identical symptoms and pleading for help that would never come, as the supernatural plague followed bloodline connections with relentless precision. The 23 deaths that would ultimately be attributed to the Howler curse represented only a fraction of the true toll, as many remote families simply vanished without trace, their fate known only to the horned beast that hunted them through the dark forests of their nightmares. Share if you've heard Ozark legends. Subscribe for the curse's full unraveling. As the curse reached its terrible crescendo in the blood-soaked winter of 1886, the supernatural forces that had been unleashed by Elias Howler's fateful discovery transformed into something far more horrifying than mere hauntings or isolated deaths. The amplified horror manifested as the cries formed a demonic chorus, a symphony of damnation that drew wildlife from across the Missouri Ozarks to witness the final act of the Howler Dynasty's destruction. Packs of wolves emerged from the deepest forests, their eyes glowing with unnatural fire as they gathered at the boundaries of the cursed farm, adding their voices to the supernatural cacophony that now echoed through the hills both day and night. Shadow creatures that had no names in any human language slithered between the trees, their forms shifting and writhing as they fed on the terror that saturated the very soil of the homestead. The surviving members of the extended Howler bloodline, scattered across 3 states but united in their shared torment, began to experience a new and more terrifying phase of the curse's manifestation. Victims described their spirits being literally devoured by the horned beast, their souls consumed piece by piece while they remained conscious and aware of their gradual dissolution. Family members who had previously suffered only nightmares and unexplained wounds now found themselves trapped in waking visions, where the creature would appear in broad daylight, its massive form materializing from shadow and mist to feed on their terror and life force. The beast had evolved beyond its original confines, no longer limited to dreams and darkness, but capable of manifesting in the physical world whenever the conditions were right. Amelia Howler Morgan, the last documented survivor of the immediate family, had barricaded herself in the cabin after discovering the bodies of her relatives. But her isolation provided no protection from the supernatural forces that had made the farm their stronghold. Her journal entries from this period, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, described how the very walls of the building seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and how the howls that had once come from outside now originated from within the structure itself. She wrote of seeing the faces of her dead family members pressed against the windows, their mouths open in silent screams as they warned her of the approaching end of their bloodline. The horned beast's influence had grown so powerful that it began to affect the natural world in ways that defied scientific explanation. Trees withered and died within a mile radius of the farm, their bark turning black as if burned by internal fire, while the streams that had once provided fresh water to the homestead ran red with what appeared to be blood. Animals that ventured too close to the property were found dead with expressions of terror frozen on their faces, their bodies unmarked, but their life force apparently drained by proximity to the supernatural nexus that the farm had become. Elias's final ritual, performed in desperation after witnessing the deaths of 4 of his 6 children, represented his last attempt to bury the cursed skull and somehow contain the forces he had unleashed. Working alone in the family graveyard during a thunderstorm that seemed to respond to the supernatural energies crackling through the air, he dug a pit deeper than any grave and attempted to return the artifact to the earth using binding ceremonies drawn from the most ancient and dangerous aspects of his ancestral lore. But the ritual backfired catastrophically, creating a permanent rift between the world of the living and the realm where the horned beast held dominion. The failure of the final ceremony transformed the farm into a nexus of supernatural activity that attracted entities from across the spectrum of folklore and legend. Witnesses from neighboring counties reported seeing lights dancing above the Howler property on clear nights, colored flames that moved with intelligence and purpose as they traced patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The chorus of howls grew so loud that it could be heard for miles in any direction, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for disturbing forces that were meant to remain undisturbed. As news of the supernatural plague spread throughout the region, tales of the Howler curse began circulating in Ozark communities, whispered in general stores and around campfires as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and curiosity. Local preachers incorporated warnings about the cursed bloodline into their sermons, using the family's fate as evidence of divine judgment against those who trafficked with pagan powers. But others, particularly those with knowledge of the old ways, understood that the curse represented something far more dangerous than simple moral punishment. It was a glimpse into forces that existed beyond human comprehension, entities that viewed mortal suffering as entertainment and human souls as nothing more than sustenance. The folkloric spread of the legend was accelerated by the accounts of traveling merchants and circuit preachers who claimed to have witnessed the supernatural phenomena firsthand. These stories, embellished with each retelling, transformed the Howler family from simple frontier farmers into cautionary figures whose fate served as a warning about the consequences of disturbing ancient secrets. The curse became a touchstone for discussions about the clash between old-world superstitions and new-world rationalism, with each side using the family's destruction to support their particular worldview. But for those who lived in the immediate vicinity of the cursed farm, the horror was far from theoretical. Families began abandoning homesteads that had been in their bloodlines for generations, unwilling to risk exposure to whatever malevolent forces had taken residence in the area. Property values plummeted as word spread about the supernatural activities, and entire communities found themselves economically devastated by their association with the Howler curse. The social fabric of the region began to unravel as neighbors turned against each other, some blaming the victims for bringing the horror upon themselves, while others insisted that the entire area was now tainted beyond redemption. The psychological impact of the curse extended far beyond its immediate victims, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that poisoned relationships throughout the Ozark region. Children were forbidden to play in the forests, farmers refused to work fields that bordered the cursed property, and even the most skeptical residents found themselves checking and rechecking the locks on their doors after sunset. The supernatural had invaded the mundane world with such force that the boundary between reality and nightmare became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Medical professionals who attempted to study the phenomenon found themselves confronting evidence that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the world operated. Dr. Samuel Morton, the county physician who had participated in the official investigation, documented cases where victims displayed wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by claws that existed on a different plane of reality, leaving marks that were visible but could not be properly treated using conventional methods. His medical journals described patients who spoke of having their souls partially consumed while remaining physically intact, creating a new category of injury that had no precedent in medical literature. The climax of the supernatural siege came when the final member of the immediate Howler bloodline, young Samuel, succumbed to the curse in a manner that defied all natural laws. Witnesses reported that the boy's death was accompanied by a manifestation of the horned beast so powerful that it temporarily materialized in the physical world, its massive form visible to anyone within a mile radius of the farm. The creature's appearance was accompanied by a howl so intense that it shattered windows in nearby buildings and caused several observers to lose consciousness from the sheer auditory assault. But rather than ending with the consumption of the last direct descendant, the curse seemed to achieve a new level of permanence, establishing itself as the eternal presence in the Missouri Ozarks that would continue to manifest for generations to come. The cries that had once been tied to specific victims now echoed freely through the landscape, no longer requiring human souls to sustain them, but existing as independent entities that fed on the fear and superstition of anyone who entered their domain. What curses haunt your family lore? Subscribe for the legacy's chilling end. The bloodline's end came with the winter solstice of 1886, when the last of the 29 documented Howler descendants perished in circumstances that defied rational explanation, leaving behind only the abandoned farm and the eternal echoes of their torment that continue to haunt the Missouri Ozarks to this day. The property itself, once a thriving homestead carved from the wilderness by determination and hard labor, was quickly reclaimed by the forest, as if nature herself sought to hide the evidence of what had transpired there. Vines wrapped around the cabin walls within months of the final deaths, and saplings sprouted from the very foundations where blood had been spilled in futile rituals, creating a green shroud that transformed the site into something that resembled an ancient ruin rather than a recently inhabited farm. The journal writings of Amelia Howler Morgan, the last survivor who had documented the curse's final manifestations before succumbing to its influence herself, were discovered decades later during a routine survey of abandoned properties in the region. These yellowed pages, hidden in a metal box beneath the collapsed floorboards of the main cabin, provided the most complete account of the supernatural forces that had consumed an entire family line and established a permanent nexus of malevolent activity in the heart of the Ozark wilderness. Her final entries, written in an increasingly unsteady hand as madness claimed her mind, described how the horned beast had achieved a form of independence that no longer required human souls to sustain its existence. Amelia's preserved writings revealed that the curse had evolved beyond its original parameters, transforming from a targeted supernatural assault on a specific bloodline into a more general threat that could affect anyone who ventured too close to the epicenter of its power. She documented how the farm had become a gateway between worlds, a permanent rift where entities from realms beyond human understanding could manifest in the physical plane. The cries that had once been limited to specific victims now echoed freely through the landscape, no longer tied to the consumption of Howler blood, but existing as autonomous phenomena that fed on fear itself. Modern echoes of the ancient curse began manifesting almost immediately after the original bloodline's extinction, with hikers and hunters reporting encounters that matched the historical accounts in terrifying detail. Local archives from the early 1900s contain numerous reports of individuals who claim to have heard the characteristic blend of wolf howls and human screams emanating from the abandoned farm site, particularly during full moon periods, when the supernatural energies seem to reach their peak intensity. These contemporary witnesses described feelings of overwhelming dread and disorientation that lasted for days after their encounters, with some reporting recurring nightmares featuring a horned beast that seemed intent on adding their souls to its eternal collection. The folkloric conspiracy theories that emerged in the decades following the curse's manifestation took on increasingly elaborate forms as researchers attempted to understand the true nature of what had been unleashed in the Ozark Hills. Academic folklorists and amateur historians proposed that the Howler family had been victims of an intentional pagan trap designed by their own ancestors to protect knowledge that was too dangerous for mortal minds to possess. According to these theories, the Irish immigrants who had settled the region in the early 1800s had brought with them not only their cultural traditions, but also guardianship of ancient secrets that required constant vigilance to keep contained. Investigators who delved into the family's genealogy discovered evidence suggesting that the Howlers were part of a larger network of bloodlines that had been tasked with maintaining supernatural barriers throughout the American frontier. Each family was apparently responsible for specific sites where dangerous entities had been bound or forbidden knowledge had been buried, with the understanding that future generations would continue their guardianship duties. The curse that consumed the Missouri branch of the family may have been triggered not by simple greed or curiosity, but by the breaking of ancient oaths that had protected both the family and the general population from forces beyond human comprehension. The eternal warning represented by the continuing manifestations of the Howler curse serves as a reminder of the price that must sometimes be paid for knowledge that was never meant for human possession. The cries that still echo through the Ozark wilderness on certain nights carry within them the accumulated suffering of 29 souls whose lives were consumed by an entity that exists outside the normal boundaries of mortality. These sounds serve as both a memorial to the dead and a warning to the living that some secrets are protected by guardians whose methods of enforcement transcend human understanding of justice or mercy. Contemporary relevance of the curse has only increased in modern times, as urban explorers and paranormal investigators have begun seeking out the abandoned farm site using GPS coordinates and satellite imagery that make even the most remote locations accessible to determined seekers. Local tour companies have learned to avoid the area entirely after several incidents involving guides and tourists who suffered psychological breakdowns after exposure to the site's continuing supernatural activity. The few brave or foolish individuals who have attempted to document the location using modern recording equipment have reported technical malfunctions that seem to coincide with the manifestation of the characteristic howls. State and federal authorities have quietly established the area as an unofficial exclusion zone, using environmental protection laws and property ownership complications to discourage casual exploration of the site. Rangers from nearby state parks report significantly higher numbers of missing person cases in the region surrounding the former Howler farm, with search and rescue operations often yielding no trace of the disappeared individuals despite extensive efforts. The official explanation for these disappearances typically involves wildlife attacks or exposure to harsh wilderness conditions, but local residents whisper of more supernatural causes. The psychological impact of the curse extends beyond its immediate area of influence, affecting the cultural identity of the entire Ozark region in ways that continue to resonate more than a century after the original events. Stories of the Howler family have become a cornerstone of local folklore, passed down through generations as both entertainment and warning. Children growing up in the region learn to respect the power of forces they cannot understand, and adults find themselves unconsciously avoiding certain areas of the forest that seem to carry an atmosphere of menace that cannot be explained by conventional means. Academic researchers have noted that the curse represents a unique intersection of immigrant folklore, indigenous spiritual traditions, and the particular isolation that characterizes frontier life in regions like the Missouri Ozarks. The Howler family's fate serves as a case study in how supernatural beliefs can manifest in ways that challenge the rationalist worldview that dominates modern Western society. Their story has been cited in anthropological studies, folklore journals, and paranormal research publications as evidence that the boundary between myth and reality may be far more permeable than mainstream science is willing to acknowledge. The technological age has brought new dimensions to the curse's manifestation, with digital recording equipment capturing audio phenomena that match historical descriptions of the supernatural howls. Social media posts from individuals who have ventured near the site often describe technical malfunctions that seem to occur precisely when the characteristic sounds begin, suggesting that the entity responsible for the curse possesses capabilities that extend beyond the purely physical realm into areas that affect electronic systems. Environmental changes in the region surrounding the former farm site have also been documented by scientific observers who remain baffled by the apparent defiance of natural laws. Soil samples from the area show chemical compositions that cannot be explained by normal geological processes, and vegetation growth patterns follow configurations that seem to echo the ritual symbols described in historical accounts. Wildlife populations show unusual migration patterns that consistently avoid the cursed area, creating what ecologists term a dead zone, where normal ecosystem relationships do not function as expected. The cliffhanger ending to this tale of supernatural horror comes with recent reports from genealogical researchers who have identified potential modern descendants of distant Howler relatives who survived the original curse by virtue of geographic separation from the epicenter of supernatural activity. These individuals, scattered across the country and unaware of their connection to the cursed bloodline, have begun reporting dreams and experiences that match the historical accounts with disturbing accuracy. Whether the curse is capable of seeking out these distant relatives across generations and continents remains to be seen, but the possibility suggests that the Howler legacy may not be as extinct as previously believed. The final warning echoes through more than a century of accumulated testimony from those who have encountered the lasting effects of the curse. Some legacies transcend death itself, creating permanent scars in the fabric of reality that serve as eternal reminders of the price that must be paid when mortals dare to disturb forces that were never meant to be unleashed. The Howler dynasty's cries continue to prove that some family sins devour not only generations, but echo across time itself, leaving only ghostly howls in the Missouri mountains, where the horned beast still hungers for souls to add to its eternal chorus of the damned. Some legacies howl forever through ancestral curses. Comment if you believe in bloodline hauntings. Subscribe for more Ozark horrors. The Howler dynasty's cries prove that some family sins devour generations, leaving only echoes in the Missouri mountains, where the horned beast still hungers.